My name is Emily Whitmore, and the day my father-in-law jabbed his finger inches from my face and shouted that I'd ruined his family was the day something inside me finally stopped shrinking. I can still see the sunlight slanting across our Indiana living room, dust floating quietly in the air, while our voices tore the room apart. I remember my hands shaking, not from fear, but from the shock of realizing he truly believed I was the enemy. That moment wasn't just an argument. It was the boiling point of months of tension no one wanted to acknowledge. And it was the moment I understood that Harold's anger wasn't about me at all. It was about everything he'd refused to face. But before I could make sense of it, my story really began months earlier, on the day Harold moved into our home. It was early September, the kind of day where Indiana weather couldn't decide if it wanted to stay warm or slip into fall. I was making coffee when Michael walked in, with that look the one husbands wear when they know the conversation ahead won't be easy. He told me his father couldn't live alone anymore after losing his wife, and the only reasonable option was for him to stay with us for a little while. Michael tried to soften it by placing his hand on my shoulder and calling it temporary. But temporary, in my experience, was one of those words that stretched itself thin until it snapped. I didn't argue. I didn't even sigh. Michael loved his father, and I wasn't going to be the one who said no to a grieving man. When Harold arrived 2 days later, though carrying boxes like he expected to stay for years, I felt the first crack in the foundation of our quiet home. At first, things were polite enough. Harold thanked me for dinner. He complimented how clean the house was, even though it sounded more like a surprise than a compliment. I tried to ignore the way he watched everything I did, like he was silently grading it. He had lived in the same farmhouse for 50 years, and old habits came with him. Meals at 6 sharp lights, off by 9 shoes, placed in a certain row by the door, everything folded his way. He never asked us to change. He just stared when we didn't. I kept adjusting. That's what daughters-in-law do right. Or at least, that's what I told myself. Slowly, though his comments changed shape, he'd look at the laundry basket and say, "In my house, shirts were never mixed with towels." He'd watch me pack our daughter's lunch and whisper, under his breath, "We never spoiled Michael like that." Once, when he thought I couldn't hear, he told a neighbor that I meant well, but didn't understand real family values. Still, I tried. I reminded myself that grief twists people, that losing a spouse after 47 years must feel like losing half of yourself, that Harold didn't mean harm. But kindness without boundaries becomes permission. The real trouble started when Harold inserted himself into every parenting decision. Our daughter Lily loved him. At first, grandparents have a way of making children feel special. But soon, he started undoing every rule we set. If we limited screen time, he'd offer her his tablet. If we said bedtime was at 8, he'd tell her 10 minutes won't hurt, which always turned into an hour. When I confronted him gently, he raised an eyebrow and said, "I raised Michael just fine." Michael tried to mediate. He told Harold we appreciated him, but needed consistency in the house. Harold nodded, said he understood, and then did the exact same things the next day. But the moment that changed, everything happened one evening in November. I walked past Lily's room and froze when I heard Harold whispering to her. "You know, he said Grandpa's old house has a big yard, bigger than this place. Wouldn't it be nice if Mommy and Daddy moved there? Mommy wouldn't have to worry so much all the time." Something stung my chest. Not anger, something sharper. Betrayal. That night, after Lily fell asleep, I stood in the hallway, trying to steady my breath. Michael wasn't home yet. The house felt too quiet, the way homes do, right before everything changes. I replayed those words over and over until they wrapped themselves around my thoughts like vines. The next morning, I approached Harold calmly. I told him he couldn't say things like that it confused Lily, that it overstepped boundaries. He didn't apologize. He didn't even hesitate. He simply said, "I'm just telling her the truth." That was the moment something in me hardened. I didn't show it. I didn't raise my voice. But I knew then that Harold's resentment toward me wasn't new. It had been simmering long before he moved in. I began watching him with new eyes, and what I saw made my stomach twist. He wasn't just grieving. He was clinging to control, to authority, to the belief that Michael belonged more to him than to the family we built together. And every time Michael defended me, even gently, I saw the way Harold's jaw tightened. The days that followed were heavy. Even the air in the living room felt charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I kept quiet, choosing peace over confrontation. But peace built on silence is a fragile thing. And then came the afternoon when Harold and I finally erupted. Michael had just left for work. Lily was at school. I was folding laundry when Harold stepped into the room with a stack of mail bills that I'd already organized. He dropped them on the table and said, "This house ran smoother before you started running everything." Something snapped. Maybe it was months of biting my tongue. Maybe it was the way he spoke to Lily. Maybe it was simply the truth rising to the surface. I told him he needed to stop undermining me. He told me I needed to know my place. I told him he didn't get to rearrange our family. He shouted that I'd taken Michael away from him. And I, finally seeing it, clearly told him his anger wasn't about losing family. It was about losing control. That was when he stepped closer, pointing his finger at me, his voice sharp enough to cut. "You ruined everything." But for once, I didn't shrink. I stood my ground, because the truth was no longer something I could swallow. Michael always said his father was a man of habits, but I didn't understand what that truly meant until the morning Harold officially became part of our daily life. It was a Sunday quiet, cool, the kind of slow Indiana morning where the streets stay empty until church lets out. I had just finished washing the breakfast dishes when I heard the gravel crunch in our driveway. I wiped my hands on a towel and looked through the window. Harold wasn't just stepping out of a car with a suitcase. No, he was supervising a friend unloading an entire pickup truck of boxes. In that moment, the pit in my stomach deepened. He walked inside, wearing the same expression he always did, polite on the surface, heavy underneath, as if the whole world was a little too disappointing. Michael greeted him with open arms, and Harold patted him on the back like they hadn't just seen each other 2 days earlier. When he turned to me, his smile faltered the way people smile when they're forcing themselves to be agreeable. "Emily," he said, "thank you for opening your home." It sounded like a sentence rehearsed in the car. We helped bring in his belongings, 3 full boxes of books, a worn recliner he insisted was better than our couch, and a clock that ticked louder than any clock had a right to tick. He walked through each room, observing everything, making quiet comments under his breath. Not criticisms, not exactly just enough to let me know things weren't done the way he used to do them. "This light switch is in an odd place. That picture frame looks crooked. You keep the thermostat that high." Michael didn't hear most of it, maybe because he didn't want to. By evening, Harold had arranged his things in the guest room, now his room. His recliner had found a place in the living room, directly beside the window, angled perfectly toward the TV. He sat down as though reclaiming a throne, and for the first time, I felt displaced in my own home. But I told myself it was temporary. Grief changes people. He needed time. I needed patience. The first week, Harold woke up before all of us. I'd come down the hallway to find him sitting in the kitchen with the newspaper spread out coffee already made strong enough to scrape paint off a barn. But he'd insist it was real coffee. He'd comment on my robe, ask why Lily's backpack wasn't by the door, or wonder aloud why I didn't start the laundry earlier. "What time does Emily usually make breakfast?" he asked Michael once, right in front of me. I didn't correct him. I didn't say that I didn't usually make breakfast, because Michael and I shared chores, depending on who had time that day. Harold came from a generation where women moved like clockwork in their homes, and part of me wanted to respect the fact that he'd lived differently for 70 years. But another part of me, one I ignored, felt the first twinge of resentment. His grief didn't soften him. It sharpened him. He clung to routines like they were life preservers, and every small deviation felt like an insult to him. If I packed Lily's lunch with snacks he didn't approve of, he'd mention how in his day kids didn't need all that. If I left dishes to air dry, he'd quietly pick them up and wipe them again, as though saving us from our own incompetence. Michael, bless him, tried to stay neutral. But neutrality isn't peace. It's avoidance dressed up as diplomacy. By the second week, Harold developed a habit of drifting into conversations that weren't his. If Michael and I discussed bills, Harold would appear in the doorway, arms crossed. If I helped Lily with homework, he'd linger nearby and correct her before I could. Once, when I was on the phone with my sister, he stood close enough to hear every word and commented afterward on things that weren't even his business. It wasn't malice. It was intrusion, wearing the costume of concern. But I kept quiet, remembering what Michael said, "Dad's just adjusting." The real turning point came one Tuesday afternoon. I returned home from the store to find Harold reorganizing my kitchen cabinets. He'd removed every plate, cup, pot, and pan and stacked them across the countertops. "What are you doing?" I asked carefully. "These cabinets were a mess," he said, without looking up. "I'm helping." Helping, a word that should have felt kind, but instead felt like sandpaper on my nerves. "I had a system," I said. He shrugged. "Well, now you'll have a better one." That night, Michael tried to smooth things over, explaining that his dad was only trying to be useful, that it was harmless. But usefulness without consent is control. And that was what Harold was seeking, a place in our home where he still held authority. He began repositioning himself within the family, attempting to take on the role he once held, decision-maker, head of the household, the one whose word settled everything. But our home wasn't built that way. Michael and I were equals. Harold saw it as disorder. And that's when things started to sharpen. He'd correct me in front of Lily. He'd question Michael's choices when I wasn't around. He'd phrase his concerns as warnings. "You'll see, Emily. You'll see when she grows up." But the moment that truly unsettled me didn't involve Lily, it involved Michael. One evening after dinner, I overheard Harold say quietly, "Son, you used to be more focused before you got married." Michael brushed it off, but I saw the way Harold watched him afterward, as if measuring whether he still had the same influence as before. He didn't, and he resented me for that. Slowly, almost invisibly, Harold's grief fused with pride and fear, until it soured into something else: selfishness, the kind that convinces a man he's being replaced in his own family, even when he's the one refusing to accept change. I still tried to be patient, to give him grace. I cooked his favorite meals. I invited him to join us for walks. I even listened to stories I'd already heard twice a week. But beneath every gesture, Harold seemed to see an accusation. And beneath every silence, I felt myself disappearing. Looking back now, I realize there's a kind of quiet danger in letting small tensions go unspoken. They don't disappear. They stack one on top of another, like folded laundry no one puts away. And just like the pile eventually topples, so did the peace in our home. By mid-October, Harold had settled into our routines, the way weeds settle into a garden, gradually, stubbornly, and always in places you didn't want them. The changes weren't sudden, but they were constant. Each day brought something new. A comment here, a sigh, their disapproval hidden under the thin disguise of concern. I tried to pick my battles, but Harold seemed to believe every moment was a battle worth picking. It started with the thermostat. I'd set it to 71 during colder evenings, normal in Indiana, especially for a house with a child. But Harold hated anything above 68. "It's wasteful," he'd mutter loudly, turning it down the second I left the room. One night, I turned it back up, walked into the kitchen, and returned to find him standing by the thermostat. Again, fingers poised, like a man guarding the last slice of pie. He didn't even look ashamed. "Cold air keeps you sharp," he said. "Not 8-year-olds," I replied. He grumbled something about soft, modern parenting and shuffled to his recliner. Michael tried to smooth it over, saying Dad grew up with wood stoves and hard winters. But excuses don't warm a house, and they certainly don't warm a marriage. Then came the laundry situation. Harold had strong opinions about how socks should be folded, opinions he shared loudly, while standing over me like a foreman inspecting a new recruit. In my house, he said, we paired socks properly. In your house, I answered gently, you didn't have a child who plays soccer 4 days a week. He didn't laugh. Harold wasn't a man who laughed easily. He preferred control, and he preferred being right. Anything that challenged those two things, especially from his daughter-in-law, clipped at his pride like shears. But the real shift happened the day I found him on the phone with Michael's aunt, telling her without an ounce of hesitation that I didn't keep a tidy enough house and let Lily talk back too much. He didn't know I was standing behind him until he turned around. He froze. I didn't. "Is this what you really think of me?" I asked. He didn't apologize. He didn't correct himself. He just said, "I'm worried about this family." Worried, as if judgment was care and intrusion was wisdom. That was the first time I felt something unfamiliar in my chest. Not anger, not hurt, but a cold heaviness. A recognition that the man living in our house wasn't simply grieving. He was rewriting the role he wanted to play in our lives. But things escalated even further when he began inserting himself into Michael's work decisions. Michael had been offered a project leadership role, something he'd worked toward for years. It meant longer hours for a few months, but also a raise and a real chance at advancement. Harold hated the idea. "You don't need more money," Harold muttered one evening while rinsing his plate. "You need to be home. Your wife can work part-time if the bills are too high." I froze with the dish towel in my hand. Michael glanced at me, then at his father. "Dad, things don't work like that anymore." "They work just fine for 47 years of my marriage." I knew he meant it as a point of pride, but it sliced through me all the same. The unspoken message was loud. A good wife stays small. A good wife doesn't challenge her husband. A good wife doesn't stand where I'm standing. He didn't have to say it. I heard it. Over the next few weeks, Harold clung more tightly to Michael's time, asking for help with small tasks he could handle himself, resetting the router, changing light bulbs, even moving laundry baskets he had clearly already moved once, just to move them again. Michael didn't see the pattern. Harold didn't want him to. But I did, and Harold knew I did. That's when his tone toward me shifted from passive-aggressive to openly sharp. "Emily," he said one morning, "I don't know why you make things so complicated. Things like what I asked. Everything." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. He delivered the words like a verdict. The worst moment came one Saturday. I walked into the living room and overheard Harold telling a visiting neighbor, an older gentleman from church, that some people marry into families just to take over. He looked at me when he said it. I didn't flinch, not yet. But inside something sank. It wasn't just the gossip, it was the implication that I was an outsider in my own home, a temporary woman in the space he believed rightfully belonged to him and his son. After the neighbor left, Harold muttered, "People should know what's happening." "What's happening?" I asked. "That I'm being phased out." I stood there stunned. "Harold, no one is phasing you out. We're trying to help you. You're trying to replace me." There it was, the sentence that exposed the truth. Not grief, not fear, not confusion. Selfishness. The belief that love was limited, that Michael's affection was a pie with only so many slices, and I'd taken his. That night, after Michael went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, the same room where the argument would later explode. I stared at the lamp, the rug, the photos on the wall. Everything looked familiar, but nothing felt like mine. Harold's presence was no longer an inconvenience. It was a shadow stretching into corners, taking up space, rewiring the atmosphere of our home. Still, I tried to hold on to hope. Still, I told myself things could get better. But small tensions don't stay small, and some shadows only grow when ignored. If I had to pinpoint the exact moment the truth about Harold finally revealed itself, not the surface-level irritations, not the habits, not the comments, but the roots, it happened on a quiet Thursday evening in late November, the kind of cold Indiana night where the sky turns navy early and the whole house feels smaller because the windows reflect darkness back at you. Michael was working late, and Lily had already gone to bed. I was sitting at the dining table, sorting mail bills, school notices, grocery coupons, when I heard low voices drifting down the hallway. One of them was Harold. The other was Lily. I set the papers down, not because I meant to listen, but because something about his tone made my stomach tighten. It wasn't the warm grandparent storytelling voice he used when he talked about feeding chickens as a kid or riding his bike to the old hardware store. No, this tone was calculated, quiet, intentional. "Sweetheart," Harold murmured, "you'd like living in Grandpa's house better. More space. A real yard. Not this little yard here." My fingers froze around the envelope I was holding. "We could have a bigger room for you. Maybe even pink paint. Wouldn't that be nice?" Lily mumbled something back, soft, unsure. "And Mommy and Daddy would be happier there too," he continued. "Sometimes grown-ups forget what's good for them." I stood so quickly, my chair scraped the floor. In that moment, I realized this wasn't about thermostats or laundry or meal times. This wasn't about grief either. This was about possession. Harold wanted his old life back, the life where he led, where he was the center of gravity, where Michael was his shadow instead of my partner. And he thought he could secure it by planting seeds in my daughter's mind. I walked toward Lily's room with my heart pounding. But by the time I reached the door, Harold was kissing her goodnight and stepping out. When he saw me, he didn't look guilty. He looked victorious. Just having a little talk, he said. What kind of talk, I asked. He waved it away. You worry too much, Emily. Children need guidance. Guidance, I repeated. Yes, he folded his arms, especially when their parents forget what matters. The boldness of it didn't shock me as much as the comfort he had saying it. Like he'd rehearsed it. Like he believed it. He walked past me without waiting for a response. I stood there, staring after him, feeling the weight of something I could no longer pretend wasn't happening. Harold wasn't adjusting to our home. Harold was trying to reshape our home. And he was willing to chip at my authority as a mother to do it. The next morning, I sat Michael down and told him everything. Not dramatically, not angrily, just plainly. The way someone tells a doctor where it hurts. At first, Michael listened quietly. Then he rubbed the back of his neck the way he does when he feels pulled between two truths. I know Dad's been difficult, he said slowly, but he loves Lily. He's just trying to feel included. I'm not saying he doesn't love her, I answered. I'm saying he's undermining me, and he's doing it on purpose. Michael sighed, looking torn in half. I'll talk to him. He meant it. He always means it. But Harold is a man who interprets gentle correction as betrayal. The talk didn't fix anything. If anything, it made Harold more defensive, more territorial, more convinced that I was the source of his slipping influence. The next week, I found Harold in the kitchen, rifling through our junk drawer. When I asked what he was looking for, he said, financial papers. I told him they weren't in there. He shrugged and said, just making sure things are in order. In order, his order. Another afternoon, I discovered he'd gone through the hall closet and reorganized our coats by warmth level. When I asked why, he said, you never know when people might need someone who actually pays attention around here. Then one Saturday, things shifted from invasive to alarming. I was wiping down the counter when Harold cleared his throat behind me. I talked to Michael, he announced. About what? About responsibilities, he said. About how you shouldn't carry so much. Maybe you should cut back at work. Be home more. My breath caught. Harold, my job is important to me. He tilted his head. Your family should be more important. And there it was, again, that old belief that a woman's place was defined by the men in her life. I set the cloth down. Michael and I decide these things together. Harold's eyes hardened. That's the problem. I felt as though he'd slapped me. But the moment that broke the last of my restraint came early December, when I overheard him telling Michael's son, you've changed since you married her. Michael didn't respond at first. He looked exhausted, stretched thin between loyalty and frustration. Then Harold added, she's taking you away from your family. My family, Michael said, voice tight, is Emily and Lily. Harold didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just stared at Michael like he'd confessed a crime. Later that night, Harold wouldn't look me in the eye. His silence wasn't grieving. Silence, it was strategic silence. Planning silence. And that's when the final truth clicked into place. Harold wasn't afraid of losing Michael. Harold was afraid of not owning him anymore. His anger wasn't about dishes or thermostats or schedules. It was about hierarchy. His hierarchy. One where he sat at the top, unchallenged, unquestioned, unbothered by the passage of time. Emily the wife was a threat. Emily the mother was an obstacle. Emily the partner was unacceptable. He needed Michael back in the orbit he'd always occupied. And the only person standing in the way was me. The living room explosion was coming. I could feel it. Michael could feel it. Even Lily seemed on edge, sensing the storm gathering in the walls. But Harold couldn't feel it, because in his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was the injured one, the displaced one, the man who believed the whole world owed him something simply because he'd lived long enough to demand it. And when a man like that feels cornered, he doesn't soften. He strikes. The day the argument finally erupted started out deceptively ordinary. A thin layer of frost clung to the grass, the kind that sparkled in the early Indiana sunlight. Lily had gone to school, wearing her pink hat, the one Harold always insisted was too bright. Michael had left early for a meeting, and I had planned foolishly to catch up on laundry before making soup. Nothing about that morning hinted that by afternoon my home would feel like a tinderbox. Harold came downstairs later than usual, rubbing his shoulder as if the weight of the world sat on it. He didn't say good morning. He walked straight past me, into the kitchen, opened the cabinets, my cabinets, and began rearranging things again. Bowls moved above the stove. Cups moved near the fridge. The coffee mugs I used every morning were suddenly behind the blender. "Harold," I said, as politely as I could manage, "I already organized those." He didn't look up. "I know. I'm fixing it." I felt heat rise in my chest. "We live here too. This is our system." He shut the cabinet hard enough to rattle the plates. "Your system doesn't make sense." That was the moment I should have walked away, taken a breath, refused to let his tone pull me under. But instead I said, "You're not helping. You're taking over." He turned slowly, like he couldn't believe I had spoken. Then he said the words that made my stomach drop. "If you did things right, I wouldn't need to." There it was, bare, unfiltered, the belief he'd been circling for months. I set the dish towel down. "Harold, this is my home." He narrowed his eyes. "It used to be Michael's home, before you changed everything." My pulse quickened. "We changed things together. That's what a marriage is." He scoffed. "Marriage." He said it like a punchline. "You married my son and turned him against me." "No," I said, grounding myself. "You're confusing boundaries with betrayal." He took one step closer. "You're confusing respect with control." "Harold, I'm not controlling anyone." "Yes, you are." His voice cracked through the room like a whip. "You think I don't see it. The way you undermined tradition. The way you took Michael from the family that raised him." My heart thudded. Michael grew up. He started his own family. That's what sons do. "No," Harold snapped, pointing at me. "That's what wives force them to do." The accusation hit harder than I expected. Not because it was true, but because he believed it with every cell in his body. I opened my mouth to respond, but he barreled on. "You ruined him, Emily. You softened him. You made him weak." I felt the words in my bones, not because I believed them, but because they were the exact opposite of the man I loved. "Michael isn't weak," I said firmly. "He's a good husband, a good father, and a good man. And you're angry because you can't control him anymore." Harold's jaw clenched. He stepped toward me again, closing the space between us until I could see the lines etched deep around his eyes. Lines carved from pride, not pain. "You took my son," he whispered, his voice trembling. "And now you're trying to take my granddaughter, too." My breath caught. "That's not true. You're poisoning her against me." I told her nothing, I replied, "but she sees what's happening." He shook his head violently. "You're lying. You're manipulating her. You're manipulating everyone." "I'm setting boundaries," I said, "because you crossed them." That was when his face changed. A switch flipped pride, turning into fury, then into something darker. "You don't get to set boundaries with me," he roared. I stood absolutely still. For the first time, I wasn't scared. I was done shrinking, done tiptoeing, done absorbing the blame he threw like stones. "This is not your house," I said. "This is not your marriage. This is not your child. You don't run this family." He stared at me, as if I'd spoken the most offensive truth he'd ever heard. Then, with a trembling finger, he jabbed the air between us. "You ruined everything. Everything." "Harold," I said quietly, "your anger is coming from the fact that you're not the center anymore. Not grief, not loss, not concern, selfishness." His face drained, not from guilt, but from shock that I had dared name it. The room felt electric. The air throbbed between us like a heartbeat. And that's when Michael walked in. He froze in the doorway, briefcase still in hand, eyes darting between Harold and me. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. Harold pointed at me. "She's disrespectful, Michael. She talks to me like I'm nothing." Dad, Michael began. "She's turning you against me." "No," Michael said firmly, stepping between us. "You're doing that on your own." Harold blinked. "What?" Michael's voice shook, not with anger, but with something more painful. "Dad, I love you, but you've been crossing lines for months. Emily isn't the problem." Harold looked betrayed. "You would choose her over your father." Michael didn't flinch. "I'm choosing the truth." Harold staggered back as if the words had weight, heavy weight. And for the first time, I saw something behind his anger, fear of fading, fear of being replaced, fear of losing the authority he believed time had guaranteed him. He sank into the recliner he'd wedged into our home and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore." And that was when I understood. The man yelling at me wasn't just furious. He was lost. But lost or not, the damage had been done. The line had been crossed. The truth had been spoken. And nothing in that living room would ever be the same again. The hours after the confrontation felt strangely quiet, too quiet for a house that had just held so much shouting, so much truth, so much unraveling. It was the kind of silence that doesn't comfort. It lingers like smoke after a fire. Michael stayed with me in the living room for a long moment, his hand resting on my shoulder, both of us staring at the chair Harold had collapsed into minutes earlier. But Harold had retreated upstairs after Michael stepped in. No slammed doors, no stomping, just a slow, defeated shuffle, and that somehow felt heavier than the yelling. That night, Michael sat on the edge of our bed, head in his hands. "I never wanted it to get this far." "I know," I said softly. "Neither did I." He lifted his head. I didn't see it clearly until today. I thought Dad was adjusting. I thought he was hurting." "He is hurting," I replied. "But hurt doesn't give him permission to hurt other people." Michael nodded slowly, the truth settling deep in his bones. "I need to talk to him. A real talk. Not tiptoeing. Not patching things up for the moment." And he did. The next morning, after Lily went to school, and before I left for work, I saw Michael knock on Harold's door, with a look I'd rarely seen in his eyes, firm, steady, determined. It wasn't anger. It was love, anchored by boundaries. I didn't stay to listen. It wasn't my conversation to hear. I trusted Michael to speak truthfully, and I trusted Harold, just barely, to listen. Hours later, when I returned home, the house felt different. Michael met me in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with a quiet seriousness. "How did it go?" I asked. He let out a long breath. "Better than I expected. Harder than I wanted." He told me everything, not every word, but the shape of the conversation. He told Harold he loved him, but wouldn't let him disrespect me or undermine our parenting, or treat our home like his old one. He told him that boundaries weren't rejection. They were survival. He told him he needed to stop blaming me for a life that had changed long before I ever entered it. And then Michael said the thing Harold needed most to hear, even if he didn't want to. Dad, you've been trying to hold on to a version of life that doesn't exist anymore. According to Michael, Harold didn't yell. He didn't deny it. He didn't try to twist the conversation. Instead, his shoulders slumped. His voice cracked. And he simply said, "I don't know how to be old." That sentence sat heavy in the air when Michael repeated it to me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't manipulative. It was honest, brutally honest. I don't know how to be old. It explained everything. The control, the interference, the criticism, the resentment, the fear of becoming irrelevant. For a man like Harold, identity had always been tied to usefulness, authority, and leadership. Losing his wife, losing his home, losing his routine, it all stripped away the structure that told him who he was. But instead of grieving those losses, he clung to control like it was the only thing he had left. That night at dinner, Harold didn't say much. He sat quietly, eating slowly, eyes fixed on his plate. Not defeated, reflective. For the first time since he'd moved in, he wasn't watching. My every move, wasn't judging, wasn't hovering. He was there, but not imposing himself. After Lily went to bed, I stepped into the living room and found Harold sitting in his recliner, staring at an old photo he kept on the end table, him and his late wife, Patricia, smiling beside their first house. She was beaming, vibrant, the kind of woman who looked like she could anchor a whole family. She kept the peace, he murmured, without looking at me. She understood me in ways I didn't deserve. I stood there quietly, unsure if he wanted company or solitude, but I didn't leave. "Harold," I said softly, "we're not trying to push you out. We just need to feel like this home still belongs to us too." He exhaled long and slowly. "I know. I didn't know where I fit anymore." "You fit," I said, "but fitting isn't the same as leading." He looked at me, then really looked, maybe for the first time since he moved in. "Michael loves you," he said, "and he listens to you. That used to be my job." The sentence wasn't accusatory. It wasn't bitter. It was simply the truth he'd kept clenched in his chest. I moved closer, not too close, but close enough that he knew I wasn't afraid. "You raised a good man, Harold. You didn't lose him. You gave him the tools to build a life." He swallowed. His voice cracked. I didn't know how to let that be enough. We stood in that fragile moment, both of us understanding something important. His anger hadn't been about me. It hadn't been about Michael. It hadn't even been about Lily. It was about loss. Loss of identity, loss of purpose, loss of the role he had always trusted to define him. I didn't forgive him instantly. Real forgiveness doesn't come like lightning. It comes like thawing ice, slow, steady, uneven. But I softened, and so did he. Over the next few days, Harold changed in small ways first. He stopped rearranging things. He stopped lingering in doorways, like a silent judge. He started asking instead of assuming. "Emily, do you mind is it all right how do you usually do this?" Simple questions, but they meant everything. He also made an effort with Lily not to influence her, not to correct her, but simply to spend time without steering her life. They did puzzles, played checkers, watched old westerns. He let her choose the snacks. He let her win once or twice, and I could see her affection coming back cautious but genuine. One afternoon while I folded laundry, Harold stepped into the room and cleared his throat. "If you ever want me to help with something," he said, "just tell me how you like it done. I'll follow your way." It was an apology, not with the word sorry, but with humility, and for Harold, that meant more. Michael noticed the change too. Their conversations became calmer, more mutual, less like tug-of-war, and more like rebuilding an old bridge plank by plank. We weren't a perfect family. We never would be. But the sharp edges had dulled. The air felt lighter. The walls didn't tense anymore. A breakthrough had happened. Not miraculous, not sudden, but real. And it was the first step toward becoming a family again. Winter settled slowly over Indiana that year. The kind of winter that muffled sounds and softened edges. Snow gathered on the branches outside our living room window, and for the first time in months, the house felt calm. Not perfect, not healed in every corner, but gentler, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Harold's transformation wasn't dramatic. He didn't wake up one morning a new man, but the shift was noticeable in the quiet choices he made. Choices that required humility, sometimes the hardest thing for an aging man to carry. He started by giving space, something I never realized I needed, until I finally had it. He stayed out of the kitchen unless asked. He let me handle Lily's routines without commentary. He sat in his recliner, not as a throne, but as a seat, one of many in the house, no longer demanding authority from it. One morning, as I packed Lily's school lunch, he glanced over and simply said, "She likes strawberries more than grapes, just in case you didn't know." The old Harold would have said it as a criticism. This time, it was information, a contribution, not a correction. And it struck me then how small shifts can feel like tectonic plates moving. A week later, I walked into the living room and saw Harold kneeling awkwardly beside Lily's small craft table, helping her glue construction paper snowflakes. His large hands fumbled with the glue stick, and Lily giggled at his clumsy attempts. He didn't scold her. He laughed too softly, like he hadn't used that register in years. I stood quietly in the doorway, watching them. It touched something deep inside me, not because everything was fixed, but because everything was finally trying. That same evening, Harold approached Michael and me while we were making dinner. "I want to talk," he said, voice steady. We set aside the cutting board and followed him to the living room. What came next wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't grand. It was raw. "I haven't been fair," he began. "Not to either of you. I was angry about things I didn't understand. Angry about losing your mother, Michael. Angry about losing the life I knew. And instead of facing it, I blamed the person who didn't deserve any of it." He looked at me then, and for the first time, his gaze didn't hold judgment or suspicion, only sincerity. "Emily," he said, "you didn't take my son away. I just didn't know how to let go without feeling like I was disappearing." I swallowed hard. "You're not disappearing, Harold. You're still here. But being here doesn't mean being in charge." He nodded a quiet acceptance, settling into his shoulders. "I know, and I want to do better." Michael reached over and put a hand on his father's arm. "We all do." From that day forward, our home ran not perfectly, but peacefully. Boundaries held. Respect grew. Trust fragile, but real, began to root. In mid-January, Harold surprised all of us by joining a seniors' woodworking club at the community center. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he left the house with a sense of purpose I hadn't seen in him since he moved in. I forgot I liked making things, he told me one morning as he packed his thermos. Your mother-in-law used to tease me about my crooked birdhouses. There was a softness in his voice, a warmth I hadn't ever heard when he talked about her before. Grief had clouded so much his judgment, his place, his identity, but now, slowly, it was clearing. Around the same time, he started taking afternoon walks, sometimes alone, sometimes with Lily. They'd walk to the small park down the road, tossing handfuls of birdseed for the winter sparrows. Lily would chatter about school, and Harold, who once insisted quiet was a virtue, listened without correcting her stories or turning her words into lessons. One evening, after a particularly long walk, Lily burst through the door laughing. "Grandpa slipped," she announced, "but he didn't fall. He said his balance is rusty, like an old tractor." Harold followed behind her with a small smile and pink cheeks. "I'm out of practice," he admitted. I laughed too, not at him, but with him, and he noticed. Small moments like that scattered across winter rebuilt a sense of family we hadn't had in a long time. Not the kind Harold once demanded hierarchical, rigid cold, but a new kind, one Michael and I had quietly nurtured for years. A family where everyone had a voice, where respect wasn't earned by age alone, where love wasn't measured by obedience, but by understanding. In February, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Harold approached me while I folded laundry in the living room. "I want to give you something," he said. He held out a small wooden box, simple but beautifully crafted. When I opened it, inside were 3 wooden figurines, a man, a woman, and a child, hand-carved, smooth, imperfect in the most human way. "I made them," Harold said, "for your family." I ran my fingers over the tiny carved faces, my throat tight. "Thank you," I whispered. "They're beautiful." He nodded, eyes brimming with something he didn't quite let fall. I didn't realize how much I was holding on until I finally let go. We stood there for a moment, 2 people who had once stood on opposite ends of the same house, now sharing a quiet understanding between us. Later that night, after Lily went to bed, I sat beside Michael on the couch and leaned my head on his shoulder. "You did the hard thing," Michael murmured. "You stood your ground even when it hurt." "We both did," I said softly. He kissed my forehead. "I'm proud of our family, all of us." As winter thawed into spring, our home felt warmer, not from the temperature, but from the shift inside each of us. Harold wasn't perfect, neither was I, neither was life. But the confrontation that once felt like the breaking of our home had become the turning point that made it stronger. And the moral, the thing I carry with me now, is simple. Sometimes people lash out, not because they hate you, but because they fear losing their place in a world that keeps moving without their permission. And sometimes standing firm in kindness, even when it's uncomfortable, is the very thing that leads them back to themselves. To anyone listening, if you've ever lived through tension with family, if you've ever questioned your worth, your role, your voice, I hope you choose boundaries without losing compassion, and I hope you choose healing over silence. If this story touched you, I'd be grateful if you shared it, left a comment, or subscribed for more stories like this. Your voice helps stories like mine find others who need to hear them.